Hey everybody, Michael Tracy here. So, for a moment, let's set aside whether you believe there is ample evidence to assert or suspect that there was some kind of active collusion between Trump and the Russian state apparatus. Leave aside that question for now. The most pernicious effect of this climate that's been stoked around Russia, to my mind, has never had much to do with Trump per se. It's had to do with the ancillary impact that this kind of paranoia has. So here's a recent example. At the Senate hearing that occurred this past week on quote unquote Russian interference, you saw a lot of rather incendiary rhetoric bandied about. One example was Kamala Harris, the new Democratic senator from California, invoking Dick Cheney and embracing Cheney's assertion that Russian involvement in the 2016 election would constitute an act of war. And Harris went on to warn about cyber soldiers. She used the quote, cyber soldiers, to identify the combatants who are active in this supposed war. So Russian cyber soldiers are hard at work launching attacks on American civil society. And who are these cyber soldiers? Apparently, they are trolls. Yes, literally. They are Twitter trolls. That's who's being referenced here. The guys with the egg avatars, or now it's some new kind of just anonymous person figure avatars who go around and they wreak havoc, and they've done this on the internet since the internet came to be. Now we're supposed to conceive of Twitter trolls, literally, and it's hard to believe that I'm even stating this with earnesty. But we're supposed to believe that Twitter trolls are now to be considered, quote, cyber soldiers, okay? So this is relevant, not for any reason having to do with Trump, but for reasons having to do with Bernie Sanders. Why? Cast your mind back to approximately this time last year, or maybe January or February of 2016. One of the big and most utterly dishonest media narratives of all time, I think, was firmly on display during that period, and that was the Bernie Bro meme. The idea was that because there are certain people who purport to be Bernie Sanders supporters on Twitter, on other social media, acting aggressively, maybe at times acting excessively belligerently, that somehow reflected directly on Bernie Sanders himself and his campaign structure, and therefore the onus was on Bernie to disavow those Bernie bros, even though he had nothing whatever to do with the Bernie bros, right? He had nothing whatever to do with these Twitter trolls who maybe were acting a little heavy-handedly online, okay? So now, and so the Hillary people, if you remember from that time period, they would say that, you know, these Bernie bros who are on Twitter attacking women and people of color, they were evidence that Bernie Sanders was essentially had his candidacy fueled by this retrograde, almost hyper masculine socialist something sentiment. They never really could have had a clear explanation of what they were alleging here, but they knew that the Bernie bros were somehow discrediting of Bernie himself and his movement, and people should look at that with suspicion. So this is relevant now because now the Bernie bros are back, and you have people, those very same people, Peter Dow, Neera Tanden, people who led the charge a year ago. Now they're back and saying Bernie Sanders, his Bernie bros, apparently they were duped. They were duped by what else? Russia. So here's what Peter Dow tweeted on March 31st. Quote, "It is becoming increasingly clear that Bernie's diehard supporters, those who became avowed Hillary haters, were influenced by Russia." So how do you come to be influenced by Russia? You come to be influenced by Russia if you maybe harbor suspicions of Hillary Clinton's corrupt activities. And your suspicions are confirmed when WikiLeaks or Guccifer 2.0 or DC Leaks puts out some kind of information corroborating your pre-existing suspicions. So that means if that's what you experience, you are influenced by Russia, and therefore you're an unwitting agent of the Russian state. So, and Neera Tanden last night on the Bill Maher show expounded on this. She said that the Russians were hard at work, quote unquote, trying to attack Hillary from the left. So the only reason that anybody would have a legitimate grievance with Hillary, quote, from the left, was because they must have been party to some kind of Russian collusion plot, right? That's what they're getting at here. They're saying that Russian disinformation is the only reason why some people had legitimate complaints with Hillary Clinton. Okay? And, when you press them, if I was speaking to Neera now, she would probably budge a little bit on the firmness of that assertion. But that's the general message that they're trying to advance here. Okay? The idea was that complaints about Hillary or the left-wing opposition to Hillary was just kind of fantastical and artificial, and only came about as a result of Russian, quote-unquote, interference or disinformation. Okay? So Neera then, she attributed a, quote, depressed Democratic turnout to what else? Russian subterfuge. Now, do we really believe that, for example, black voter turnout in Milwaukee plummeted as a result of WikiLeaks releasing some emails that reflected poorly on the Hillary Clinton campaign, or that black voters in Detroit were so aghast at John Podesta's internal machinations that they refused to vote for Hillary Clinton? Of course, there's always going to be a confluence of factors in any election, but the idea that Tanden is trying to attribute a disproportionate share of the culpability to Russia means that the people who had the complaints from the left about Hillary or about the Democratic Party, they are now lower in the totem pole in terms of their legitimacy. If all this was just part of some overarching Russian plot, then the people who are the left-wing critics, they just seem almost, I don't know, they seem just inconsequential in comparison. So that's the effect of this meme that's being spread. Forget, again, I haven't mentioned Trump's potential collusion or that whole aspect of the story at all yet. I basically said that look what this paranoia is resulting in. One other theme during the Senate hearings, and this was sort of affirmed last night by Neera Tanden and by Keith Alexander, who's the former NSA director who was on the Bill Maher show as well. I'm sorry. It wasn't Keith Alexander on the Bill Maher show. It was Michael Hayden. Keith Alexander, in one of the Senate hearings this past week, said of the Russian motives, allegedly. He said, quote, "Senator, I think what they were trying to do was drive a wedge within the Democratic Party between the Clinton group and the Sanders group." Okay? So, if you are among the millions of people whose actions publicly somehow contributed to driving a wedge or highlighting the divisions between the Sanders faction of the Democratic Party or the Sanders ideological movement and the establishment Clinton wing of the Democratic Party, then you, per the framework that was laid out this week in the corridors of power, you are now an unwitting agent of the Russian state. Congratulations. I mean, that's the logical conclusion of this kind of thinking. If a Russian aim was to drive a wedge between the Clinton group and the Sanders group, and your actions in some way contributed to that, then yes, you are party to this amazing geopolitical scheme. And you are, in some sense, responsible. So you're an unwitting agent, because remember, to be an unwitting agent, you don't have to wittingly do anything. you could just take an action which in some tangential, ill-defined sense furthers a Russian government aim, and therefore you are guilty, my friend. So you better watch out, because if we go back into your Twitter history or your Facebook history or somewhere, and you even shared a WikiLeaks email, and you said, hey, this kind of verifies my suspicions about Hillary and how the factions of the party are sort of unbridgeably divided, then you were doing the bidding of the Russian state. That's the consequence of all this. So, what is the ultimate point here? The ultimate point here is that the real noxious consequence of the Russian interference hacking story has never been so much about Trump as an individual or the fortunes of his administration, although that is an aspect of it, obviously. The real detrimental effect of all this is that the Russian hacking story has become a means of enforcing ideological orthodoxy. It's become a means of shrinking the boundaries of what is considered acceptable political thought. Because if you watch these hearings this past week, it wasn't all about Russia trying to foment right-wing insurgencies. It was about how they're also interested in fomenting left-wing insurgencies. So anybody at either end of the spectrum can, in some sense, be accused of abetting Russian subversion. So what does that have? It has a chilling effect. It might not have a chilling effect for me or you or other people who are a little more attuned to the intricacies of how these stories operate in a propagandistic way. But there are people, say in Washington, D.C., who don't want to jeopardize their political, their career prospects by adopting a view which could be construed as somehow reflecting a Russian government aim or goal. And those are the people who are in positions of power and exert influence over how the country is governed. And then just ordinary people in their everyday lives who might be casual news consumers and might see this story about how, oh my God, Bernie Bros, they were heavily influenced by Russia. I better not, get on board with their program, because then that means I'm complicit in this Russian subversion plot as well. It creates a stifling effect, a chilling effect. So all the time, people are meant to now be second-guessing their motives, or second-guessing whether the views they espouse could, in some remote sense, bolster Russian objectives. And that's just classic McCarthyism tactics. You don't have to have any tangible connection to Russia in order to be considered a Russian agent. So that's why this is noxious. That's why it's disconcerting to me when I see the Bernie Sanders Twitter account tweeting out stuff which furthers this alarmist narrative. Because not everything is about Trump. Not everything begins and ends with how it impacts on Trump or his ability to remain in office. There are a lot broader, longer-term political effects that we ought to be cognizant of. And this is one of them, and it's very insidious. It's having effects that are going to be long-lasting. And that's about it. I will include, as usual, some citations in the description box of this video. And that'll do it for now. Talk to you later.